Well, thank you very much, Matt, and it's great to be here with you this morning. The work that Policy Exchange has been doing in this area on energy policy and also on industrial strategy is incredibly important. And this event this morning, which really sort of marries the issues of energy security, meeting our commitments around renewables, is incredibly important, and also marries with the work on industrial strategy. And of course, we're expecting both the Clean Growth Plan from the government later this month and the Industrial Strategy White Paper later this year, so the government say. So the work that you're doing, the Policy Exchange and the speakers we're going to have today, a really important input into that. The issue of electricity and meeting both our renewable obligations as well as the cost of electricity and our energy security have been in the news again this week, but often for the right reasons rather than the wrong reasons. So the announcement yesterday about the result of the contracts for difference auction on offshore wind, which saw the price of that fall dramatically, is very good news, I think, both in terms of Britain's capabilities in that sector and for all of us as consumers. And we're going to hear a little bit today from Harry Holt from Rolls-Royce about what that business is doing in terms of modular nuclear reactors, which is very exciting, and I'm sure you'll be pleased to learn more about that. We've also got Lord Howell of Guildford with us today, who of course, amongst his many former roles, was the former Secretary of State for Energy, but most recently served as President of the Energy Industries Council. And we've also got with us shortly Dr Jenifer Baxter from the Institution of Mechanical Engineers. And with Matt as your chair, you're in good hands. I am chairing my first meeting as chair of the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Select Committee this morning with our new members, where we're going to be agreeing our work programme for the weeks and months ahead. And rest assured, some of the issues that you're going to be touching on today are going to be right at the centre of our agenda as a select committee. So I look forward to working both with you, the Policy Exchange, and also the speakers and many of you in this room in the months and years to come, as we both hold the government to account on issues of energy, business and industrial strategy, but also try and take forward some of these policy issues for the best interests of British business and also consumers. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. That's a very important role she's taking on. I think a select committee, there used to be a select committee just for energy, and now you've added in business and industrial strategy. At the time of Brexit, I think that's going to be a very challenging role to take on. So before I go to our panelists, and we'll give Jenifer time to arrive, I'll just a few housekeeping issues, and I'll give an introduction, and then I'll let the panelists give 5-minute opening statements. The eagle-eyed amongst you will know that I'm not Richard Howard. Unfortunately, Richard left us 2 months ago. He is now head of research at Aurora Energy in Oxford. And he's currently cycling around, I think, the French Alps for charity. But we wish Richard very well.
Do I need to change my shoes?
Will
You won't be able to see them?
The other thing you'll notice is that we do not have an entrepreneur on the panel. We have to apologise that the person we had in mind could not be here. And so we didn't have time to find a suitable replacement. So apologies if you turned up on the false pretense of a mystery guest, but you'll have to just make do with our eminent panel here today.
Do you want me to put it underneath? Or
so today, as well as talking about the electric economy, we're going to launch a new piece of research the Policy Exchange is going to be doing over the next few months on small modular nuclear reactors. This is supported by Rolls-Royce. And when I first applied to Policy Exchange about a year ago, I had to come up with an idea for a research proposal as part of the interview process. And I wanted to do a piece of research on small modular nuclear reactors. Partially this was because I'd just done a PhD at Cambridge University, and part of the topic there was small modular nuclear reactors. So it was relevant to my interests, but also because it's going to become such an important issue for the government. We have the SMR competition coming up with results from that due imminently. And also with the difficulties we're having with large nuclear reactors. Hi, Jennifer.
Hi, sorry.
Welcome. And the difficulty we're having with building large nuclear reactors, and small modular reactors might be able to form a role in our energy system. I should talk a little bit about that, because it was part of my PhD, is that we've gone to larger and larger nuclear reactors over the years, and there were good reasons for this in the beginning. The economies of scale they generated was supposed to bring down costs, but they became very, very large and very, very expensive, and this isn't unique to nuclear power. The government the National Audit Office actually have a book for guidance and optimism bias on large infrastructure projects. So all large, complicated infrastructure projects have this kind of inherent susceptibility to people being overly optimistic about bringing down costs. And there's actually a famous or infamous research paper by Grubler called Nuclear Power in France, a case of negative learning by doing, whereby for other technologies, learning by doing, you typically have this learning rate that brings down costs over time, and he charted the costs going up in France over the years, which was fair to a certain extent, but not fair in a different way, because that was different nuclear reactor designs. So the way you bring down nuclear power cost is to invest in one technology, one reactor, standardize it, and then churn them out. And there have been instances in the past, even with large reactors, where costs have been brought down in that way. And that is the idea with small modular reactors, except you have the additional benefit of building the reactor vessel in a factory environment, which will hopefully bring down costs more over time. But we're not just going to talk about small modular reactors. This event is broader about the electric economy. So it's been in the news all this week about electric cars, where countries are falling over themselves to promise to ban petrol and diesel vehicles at ever earlier points in time. I think we're getting into the 2020s almost now. Smart power, which we've been working on before my time. Richard Howard put out Power 2.0, which looked at the smart grids and smart technology. And recently we put out Driving Down Emissions on how to clean up road transport, which focused largely on electric vehicles, but also on hydrogen, autonomous vehicles, modal shift, and things like this. And you can find both of these on our website. But now I'd like to bring in our panelists. And I'd like to start with Harry Holt, president of Rolls-Royce Nuclear. And Harry, as a company looking to lead on civil nuclear power, what do you think are the main challenges of moving to an electric economy? And what do you think are the main innovations that excite you and get you up in the morning?
So thank you very much. So I think the challenge facing the UK is that three things are going to happen in parallel to one another in the energy market over the next 10 to 20 years. And that's going to create a substantial requirement for new low-carbon electricity generating capacity. So the first of those is that we're going to lose about 2/3 of the 84 gigawatts of currently installed capacity over the next 10 or so years, as all of the coal-fired plants get retired and all bar one of the large nuclear plants reaches the end of their life. The second thing that's going to happen is the actual demand for electricity is going to increase, driven by economic growth, driven by demographic change, driven by the electrification of the economy, importantly the electrification of heating and transport. And so most forecasts predict that from our current level of demand, which is around 336 terawatt hours per year, we're going to grow at about 20% over the next 20 years. And potentially, if you look out to 2050, that number rises to 520 terawatts. So the demand for electricity is going to grow substantially. And then the third thing that's happening and going to intensify is the pressure to reduce carbon emissions as we struggle to meet our own obligations in the 2008 Climate Change Act, which requires us to reduce by 80% from 1990 levels carbon emissions by 2050. And to give you some idea of the scale of that challenge, last year we produced, the grid produced about just less than 150 terawatt hours of low carbon power. By 2030, we're going to be needing to produce 350, by 2040, 425. So we're talking about a 2 to 3-fold increase in low carbon power generation. So what that means in terms of a challenge to the industry is that we're going to need to install about 95, just short of 100 gigawatts of electricity generating capacity by 2035, which is effectively replacing the entirety of what we've currently got and a little bit more on top of that. And if you look beyond 2035 to 2050, that could go up to as high as 140 gigawatts. And that, meeting that capacity of, let's say, 140 gigawatts by 2050 has to be done by a mix of technologies. We can't be dependent on one technology alone. So a mix of renewables, of CCGT with carbon capture systems, and of course nuclear. None of those can meet the requirements on their own. Renewables lack the power density and lack the load factors to rise to the challenge alone. Carbon capture system technology is still some years away from full maturity, and even when it is at full maturity, it's unlikely to capture much more than 80 to 90% of the carbon emissions from gas-fired plants. So nuclear needs to play a part in that mix, potentially providing about 40 gigawatts of that 140 gigawatt total in 2050, or to put it in percentage terms, about 28% of the installed capacity. Now, interestingly enough, because of the very high load factors on nuclear power plants, last year the nuclear power plants in the UK were working at load factors of just shy of 80%, which is their highest year ever since 1998. So bearing in mind those load factors, 28% of the installed generating capacity translates into about 50%, just shy of 50% of the actual supply to meet the country's demand. So as a player in the nuclear industry, we've really got two challenges. The first is to replace the 20 gigawatts or so of currently installed nuclear capacity that's going to retire over the next 10 to 15 years. And the second challenge is to do the same again in terms of additional capacity to meet the energy demands of this country during the 2030s and 2040s. And that really is why Rolls-Royce has spent as much time and effort as it has on a small modular reactor program. We launch our report later on today called UK Small Modular Reactor, a National Endeavour. And we believe that these small modular reactors are going to have a very high load factor, very high rates of utilisation. We believe they're quicker and easier to build. They therefore significantly reduce the financing burden and ultimately provide competitive electricity into the market. And importantly, the consortium that we put together is a UK one, because we believe that this is actually more than just a solution to the country's energy challenges. We believe that by creating the technology and the IP here in the UK, it can bring considerable socio-economic benefits in terms of highly skilled jobs, in terms of exports, and in terms of a complete rejuvenation, if you like, to the nuclear industry, rejuvenating the skills and the supply chain, which I think is something that is pretty desirable given the overall demands that are likely to be made on the sector over the next 20 to 30 years.
Thank you, Harry. Yes, so when people say, Matt, why are you still open to the idea of nuclear power? I usually quote one of my heroes is the late, great Sir David Mackay, who in his book, Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air, says, I'm not pro-nuclear, I'm pro-arithmetic. And any time I follow the 100% renewable energy studies quite closely, and I've yet to be convinced by any of them. I think we do need a mix of technologies. But I was speaking to Lord Howell in the green room beforehand, and it's safe to say you have some criticisms of energy policy in the UK over the last decade or so. Lord Howell, would you like to expand on energy policy and our attempts to decarbonise our electricity system?
Right, well, I'll start. Well, we're looking here at, in policy terms, at a scene of great hope, which you've just heard about now, which is the prospects of nuclear low-carbon power really bringing down the costs, shortening the building time and all the other things that worry people, and indeed addressing problems of waste and other public concerns as well. That is the path of hope. But we're also looking at a scene of utter chaos and potential catastrophe, which is the current energy arrangements we now find ourselves in here in 2017, which they're embodied in a way in the Hinkley Point C situation, which we'll come to in a moment, with all its problems. But actually behind it lies a long string of very, very serious policy errors and blunders, ranging back from Mr. Miliband and the end of the Labour governments right through the coalition under Mr. Hoon and Mr. Davey, and lingering on into the present political scene, rather confused political scene as well. The root of it, I think, lies a totally unbalanced approach to how we achieve effective carbon per ton of carbon reduction costs, and what contribution that makes to the world of climate change challenge and so on, and the way in which the cost aspect of reduction in carbon was simply ignored. And the commitment driven on by the Climate Change Act, of course, as we know, was really to achieve carbon reduction at any cost or regardless of cost, whatever it took in terms of initially subsidies on the renewable side or subsidies to get a so-called nuclear renaissance replacement of our old nuclear fleet. And that led to some catastrophic decisions, of which, as I say, Hinkley C is the classic example. Behind this also lies the fact that, well, as we know, the assumptions were that oil and gas prices would stay very high. They haven't, and they won't, and they're not going to return to the $100 and $120 levels so widely forecast. And the assumption, too, that renewable costs were not going to come down very fast. And it may be even that assumption is crumbling before our eyes now as we see these remarkable figures of the offshore wind investors are prepared to go for. They're talking about figures well below £60 per megawatt hour, 59, 58. And of course, if I agree it is an if the storage breakthrough that's so widely talked about is really around the corner, that will turn into 59, will come 49, come 39. These figures, when you're looking at where do we go for low carbon, the best low carbon investment, simply crumble and destroy the foundations of the assumptions on which most of the large nuclear current program rests, and particularly Hinkley Point C, which, as you remember, is based on a degree of subsidy in the construction, and then a huge ongoing subsidy of 35 years, index-linked at £92.50 per megawatt hour. It was going to be 89 if Sizewell D was built, or sorry, Sizewell C, but that looks a bit unlikely at the moment. And this is a program where already the cost overrun has been announced for a further 1.5 billion for some sort of additional learnings, EDFs say, where the delay is now hinted to be another 1.5 years to 2027, and will probably continue, where there are considerable difficulties inside EDF, which you're all familiar with, leading to the rather dramatic resignation of their finance director, and considerable problems for EDF inside France as they face their own renewal problems in nuclear reactors. So here we are in 2017 building a huge machine, 18, 20, 23, we don't know, 20. National Audit Office talked about 30 billions of subsidy, which are on a design which has never yet worked. It may be that in China they're just getting it together, but of course the Finland one was a disaster and bankrupted the main supplier to EDF, Areva. And the Flamanville one has delayed and delayed and delayed and is running I don't know how many years behind schedule and I don't know how many times over budget. And this is the machine which is supposed to be heralding the nuclear replacement and renaissance in Britain. And it's a very, very bad story. In China, the major investors from China are beginning to get extremely uneasy about it, as we all know, and are thinking much more in the terms that Mr. Holt has rightly described of moving to, as fast as they can, to smaller modular reactors, including their so-called nimble dragon. The rest of the British nuclear renaissance program is not looking very healthy either. Welfare and the Hitachi-led consortium is all right and can be entered into. I don't know what they're discussing in terms of price subsidy, but one hopes it'll be much lower than anything suggested at Hinckley. But at Moorside, Toshiba have gone pear-shaped and want to pull out of the whole thing, and we need another partner, and we don't know where to look. And do we go to the Koreans? Is Korea a good place to be going to? Just South Korea is a good place to be going now for rescuing our program? I don't know. But these are very, very serious policy consequences from huge policy errors, and they open up a prospect in the next 10 years of a real serious shortage of electricity capacity. Where is it going to come from? The gas-fired combined cycle gas turbines are simply, the new ones are not being built because there's no money in it at all with the zero marginal cost of wind and so on. The coal-fired stations are continuing to be closed down, although even now, even as they're being closed down, such as the chaos of policy, they're also being subsidized and encouraged to stay open as part of the capacity assurance system designed from the capacity auctions. Such is the confusion. You are looking at, I think, one of the most serious policy muddles in Britain of the last 10 years. All parties are to blame. It fits very well, those who remember Barbara Tuchman and the March of Folly, the great follies of history, where the whole establishment, all parties are all agreed something's a marvellous idea, and it turns out to be a disaster. She starts with the Trojan horse and goes on to America and the dominoes in Vietnam. But today, if you want a march of folly, look at the British energy policy and climate policy over the last 10, 12 years and see where we have got to, and the really very, very serious dangers ahead in terms of high energy costs, unreliability, serious power interruptions, a huge damage to and fuel poverty and damage for poorer families, and an undermining of a lot of British industrial effectiveness. It is a very, very serious situation. I believe in due course, in the British way, there will have to be a fundamental inquiry into the whole way in which this came about. But in the meantime, we put our little prayers and our hope on the genius of Rolls-Royce and others in getting costs down through much cheaper, quicker, faster to build, safer, quicker learning curve, low cost, low carbon nuclear power which can deliver. That's one of our hopes, but it's a hope for the future against the chaos of now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lord Howell. Not very optimistic about the electric economy, but it is a very challenging situation we have. I would think in the short term, it's quite obvious that we're going to need some gas-fired power stations, and they can be built quite quickly. And I think all it takes is really for the government to get on with building a few of those and having National Grid put in the requisite. They've already purchased some through the capacity market, so I don't think we're going to have blackouts, but we do have in the short to medium term this amazing challenge of meeting this black hole. And also I should lay my cards on the table that my PhD was sponsored by the company that designed the Hinkley Point C nuclear power reactor. So you can take my comments on that. But Jenifer, maybe moving on to the electric economy itself, what do you think are the policy challenges, and what do we need to do to take advantage of smart grids, electric vehicles, and so on?
Sure. So good morning, everybody. I do apologise for being late. I live in Cardiff, and we're currently experiencing the electrification of the railway line going out that way. So we currently have fewer trains, more people on them, and significant delays. I left at 5:30 this morning, so and then barged my way across London, knocking over a few foreign students on the way. So I do apologise for that. But I'm going to talk about two things. One is about engineering and resources, and the other is about people. And I think they're the two elements that often we don't talk about. We talk a lot about cost. We talk a lot about the various ways in which policy changes all the time and the politics that surround it. But often we actually forget about how policy influences engineering and how it influences people. So from my point of view, the high-level policy hasn't really changed. It's the Climate Change Act. We have to reduce our CO2 emissions. That's remained fairly consistent since 2008. I can't see that changing anytime soon, so that's what we have to work with. The minor policy changes that happen around that will continue to change, whether that's to do with the level of subsidies, whether it's to do with CCS, all of those sorts of things I think will fluctuate depending on who is in power at that time. So as an industry, we have to work with what we have. So thinking about it from an engineering and a sustainable development point of view, some areas that I wanted to talk a bit about is how we think about policy around resources. And we have a lot of fantastic resources that already exist in the UK. We look very often to start to make new stuff all the time. We say, this isn't working the way we want it, so let's build something new, let's do more new, rather than looking at what we have and how we adapt and innovate within the incumbent system that we have. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about infrastructure, a bit about waste, and a little bit about sustainable materials and how we make a decision on why we choose certain materials. So some examples of this, and I sort of put my cards on the table. My PhD is in hydrogen production from waste, so where I'm coming from will probably become fairly obvious as we go through. Now, we produce massive amounts of waste in this country. Very little of it is realistically recycled. We have a lot going to what they are now calling advanced conversion techniques, which some people will have seen came out in the new capacity markets auction that happened yesterday. And this is actually just energy production from waste. Now, this is actually, from my point of view, it's a really good thing. You can generate electricity, but you can also generate gas. We can also look to areas like nuclear and the renewables sector to continue to electrolyse, to make hydrogen gases, to look at ways in which when we have a surplus of electricity on the grid, we can actually use all of that resource rather than wasting it, which is a lot of what happens now. It also provides us with a very different medium for storage than batteries, which is what people often think about when they consider storage. So turning our food and sewage waste into biogas. This allows us to create biomethane, which we can power vehicles with. We can put it into our gas grid, looking at ways that we can decarbonise that way. Now, people will say, well, it's still methane. Yes, it is, but it isn't virgin methane. It's stuff that we have already created, and we're reusing it, maximising that resource. So when we talk about power to gas, that is looking at renewables to electrolyse, that's looking at nuclear to electrolyse. It's looking at ways we can use low carbon technologies in order to create more low carbon technologies. We can produce hydrogen, which is an alternative to the current view of an electric vehicle. It provides us with gas that we can also create power with, and we can put it again into the gas system for cooking and heating, again adding a level of decarbonisation to the heating system. The heat area is the next key point that we will have to decarbonise. It is around 40% of the whole energy system, possibly more in Scotland, and it's an area that has had very little change since it kind of came into its being as we know it in the 70s. So that's an area that we can really make some changes. Now, there is another area that relates to the nuclear sector and to small modular reactors, and that's around having some form of government policy for MOX fuel. At the moment, we have a phenomenal amount of energy that is sat in storage that we're not using that could be accessed. And I don't understand from a sustainability point of view why we would want to create new nuclear fuel when actually we could create technologies, whether they're small modular reactors or larger ones, that actually use up this energy. We should be maximising everything that we take from the planet, not sitting on it, looking at it and hoping that one day our politics will change that will allow us to use it. That's what sustainable development is. And one of the great things about power in terms of nuclear power is that you can make a lot of power from not very much material. So those are the areas that I consider we need to think a bit more about around. It could be considered the circular economy. If you're around 10 years ago, it would have been the National Industrial Symbiosis Programme. These things have been around for a long time, but we've never really been courageous enough to actually challenge ourselves to do it properly. So I think that these are areas that as engineers and as policy makers that we can make big changes. I think another area when we talk about materials is I have a lot of questions, and often if you're not in the popular camp as to what seems to be the right thing to be doing right now, your questions are often seen as that you are not into the new technology or you are not a supporter of renewables. But one question I have is particularly around the role of lithium-ion batteries versus fuel cells. Now, lithium is a material that is mined. Currently, it's a fairly low energy process, but as you increase the amount of lithium that's used, much higher power crushing techniques will be needed to extract lithium to meet the needs that we have. Cobalt, which is a material that is used in cathodes for these batteries, comes from one of the probably least ethical mines that there is in the world, and there are only very few areas where you can access this. And I think in these cases we have to start saying to ourselves, is what level of impact are we prepared to have on other people's lives so that we can have the lifestyle and meet the carbon targets that we want to achieve? And that's where sustainable development comes in, and how you should think about how we manage resources more effectively. So the last bit I want to talk about, as I could go on all day about sustainable development, is about people. It's something that I think has got considerably worse since I've been working in the energy field, is the way in which we have a kind of my technology is better than your technology approach. We start comparing small modular reactors with offshore wind. They have no relationship. They create a different type of power. The equation doesn't even add up to be remotely similar. We compare or somehow use electric vehicles as a method of storage. This isn't something that even exists at the moment. It's a way that we're imagining our future. And actually what we have is a collective goal to reduce our emissions. It's everybody in the industry is trying to achieve the same thing. We're all trying to ensure that we can continue to live on the planet as a human race. That's the ultimate goal. So why we don't support and collaborate more across different sectors? I am as big a supporter of wind and solar as I am of nuclear power. I want to ensure that solar panels are disposed of properly, that their wastes don't end up on somebody else's shores. I want to ensure that our plastic that's produced from gas doesn't end up polluting someone else's life. And we're collectively all in this together. So making sure that the industry itself stops arguing amongst itself, we could actually move forward much more effectively. So I think that those are areas where policy and people can start to actually support each other to deliver good engineering, good solutions, not just for the UK, but also to lead much more globally on the way in which we think about how our lifestyles affect those people in other places. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm very interested in hydrogen as well. I mean, the title of this event, the electric economy. The electric economy is not sort of a phrase that has entered the lexicon just quite yet, but the hydrogen economy, I just looked back at a Parliament Office, well, it was a post-Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology report on the prospects for the hydrogen economy, 2001. And so we've been talking about that for a long time, and I just wanted to follow up on the decarbonizing heat is very, very difficult. We talked about the challenge of decarbonizing our electricity system. Heat is an order of magnitude higher than that. And just to follow up on Jennifer's point, how much waste do we have, and what percentage of our energy needs could we get from our waste?
Well, in terms of, I think I'd probably have to go away and do a sum to work out exactly what it is. But what I am fairly clear on is that more and more we are seeing energy from waste plants popping up, and that they are becoming part of what we see as the way in which we produce electricity. One of the areas that we have to be slightly careful with energy from waste is that should we resolve our issues on how much we consume and actually start to recycle more effectively or produce less waste, that means that these plants will have to adapt to either using different feedstocks, or that they will have to ensure that there is some other way that they can achieve ultimately still producing electricity. So we do have to be careful, but that's, I can't see our behaviour changing anytime soon. It hasn't changed in the 20 years I've worked in the environment sector. In fact, I think we may actually be producing more waste, certainly more food waste, and we're still producing probably broadly the same amount of sewage. So all of these things can contribute to the electricity, and it can be through burning gas or using it just through the gasification and using the heat and various things to actually produce electricity.
I think the challenge on heating is a really considerable one. I mentioned it as part of one of the key challenges in electrifying the economy. So in terms of carbon emissions, actually electricity generation only accounts for about 25% of the country's carbon emissions. And if you look at the consumption of gas, about 70% of the country's consumption of gas is either for residential heating or for commercial and industrial heating. So to increasingly electrify that bit of the market is a challenge. And of course, one of the things that you can do with nuclear power small modular reactors is actually use that to address the heating challenge as well.
Yes. I think it's clear it's going to take a range of technologies to decarbonize our heating system. I wrote a blog a couple of weeks ago on how it's potentially we can replace parts of the gas network with hydrogen incrementally. You can also have heat pumps, you can have heat from waste, and depending on whether you have a new build, it's a lot easier if you have a new build estate than if you have a city like London. How do you install enough heat pumps and everything in a city like that?
I would just follow up that's a critical point, that the housing policy has to start to connect with the infrastructure development and the utility policy. At the moment, that isn't happening. So if we do want to build new towns and, well, potentially what could become cities, I'm not entirely sure that I understand why we don't already look at smart grids, why we're not looking at the redistribution of the energy and the heat system that actually is produced and used by communities. So I think that there is a lot that can be done in terms of connecting policies.
Please don't forget, this leads on to, don't forget, the key to this is energy efficiency, a vast increase in the efficiency and the use of and what we get out of a unit of electricity. There's huge gains to be on the energy efficiency side, and investment in that, which might well exceed all the investments we put on the supply side.
Yes, I'm just in the process of writing a short history of UK and EU energy policy, and sort of two of the successes that I've picked out of that are closing down coal. So the UK has been successful, more successful than other countries with the carbon price and carbon support has sort of made coal less economic, and it's sort of falling out of favour. We put a limit on the amount that new power plants can emit, which sort of effectively banned new unabated coal plants. And the other, like you say, Lord Howell, is energy efficiency. So investment in energy efficiency, new product regulations. It's a sort of a market failure that you can fix.
I'm going to make myself Mr. Unpopular this morning. I already am. You're wrong about coal, of course. There are perfectly sensible economic ways for beginning to reduce the emissions from coal, and for more efficient coal, supercritical and hypercritical boilers, maybe a cheaper version of CCS, although the present one is wildly expensive. All sorts of possibilities which were short of closing down coal, particularly when, of course, in Asia, they're opening up coal at a massive degree. If we're really interested in combating climate change and getting down CO2, then there are much better ways than the one we've taken of trying to close down coal altogether. This obsession that all coal is bad and can never be compatible with greenery is, of course, an immensely damaging and costly perception, which has caused us great grief and is going to cause us very serious problems in the future and additional costs of a very large degree.
Well, I'm a big fan of coal, but only with carbon capture and storage, and I think it's one way of decarbonising our heavy industry, but we're not here to talk about that today. I'd like to move back to electric cars if we can. Does any of the panel own an electric car, for a start?
I have a Prius. It's somewhere between the two.
It's expensive on CO2, of course.
I'd just like to do a poll. Can anyone put up a hand if you own an electric car? Oh, we're such Neanderthals in this room. None of us have gone to the next step. So in our report, Driving Down Emissions, the generous subsidies on offer, especially if you live in London, you get exemption from the carbon taxes, or not the carbon taxes, the congestion charges and so on. I think it's already cost competitive with traditional diesel and petrol vehicles. And Jennifer, you talked about the potential of integrating battery technology into the grid. Do you think that's further away than a lot of people think?
Well, I think if you were talking to a battery promoter, they'd probably tell you it's much closer than I might. But I think one of the issues with the batteries, particularly for the number of people we have living in homes who are going to find it very difficult to have their own charging point, means that we have to look at housing policy again. We have to look at retrofitting for individuals to actually be able to not only charge their cars, but actually feed back into the grid in any meaningful way. So there aren't really that many people as a percentage who live in a situation where it's easy for them to drive up to their house and plug in. So there will have to be a major infrastructure change, which people are looking at. And I read yesterday an article about how local authorities are starting to look at how they can put this infrastructure in. But it's a huge change, and if you add autonomous to electric vehicles, you could actually be looking at increasing the number of vehicles on the road as well, creating more congestion, because it's much more easy for people who don't drive to access a car.
Very good point.
Laura Howell, do you want to come in?
No, I think that's right. When we talk about electrifying transport, we mustn't forget rail. And rail potentially in the short term is going to make even greater demands on electricity generation than electric cars. But if you take the current exponential growth in electric vehicles, very surprising that no one in the room owns one, but I don't. So, so the number of electric vehicles has basically doubled between 2014 and 2016. And if it continues to grow at that rate, or it potentially even grows faster, which is generally the experience of all new technologies, then actually we're going to have a far greater demand on our electricity generating capacity from electric vehicles than we've currently forecast, which just exacerbates the problems that we've got in terms of capacity.
And materials management, because all of those batteries create some kind of waste that currently less than 5% of lithium-ion batteries are recycled. So you can look at, if it grows exponentially, we're going to have to look at creating a new industry that can manage that.
Well, I was going to pick up on your point about, well, you can comment on this, but I was also going to pick up on your comment about energy efficiency. What are the specific things that we can do in terms of energy efficiency to?
Well, it's the word is technology. I know we tend to be sort of, we lay people think it's any miracle can happen, but there is no doubt that amazing things are happening in the more efficient use of electricity and more efficient use of all energy. I mean, we only have to, I think we're talking about electric cars, but think what in the last 20 years has happened to the humble petrol engine. I know the diesel engine, which everyone told they had to buy 10 years ago by the experts, or 20 years ago, because it was lower on CO2 emissions, turned out to be even worse on nitrous oxide. And therefore everyone toward diesel has been, in a sense, of conned and caught. But petrol engine efficiency is staggeringly jumped from the last 10 years, from the old sort of talk of 25 miles a gallon, so on, down to 80s and 90s and less. So, and there's obviously room for a vast further developments on that side too. So I think it's the electricity side's got to compete with the super efficient, very low emission hydrocarbon-driven engines of various sorts. My more general point is, Jennifer was rightly saying, while we're all arguing the thing is the world's in danger from climate change, it certainly is. I agree with that. I agree. I think if one's looking for harmony and cooperation, I'm a slightly personal puff. I just wrote a book called Energy Empires in Collision, saying that if the energy businesses worked with the green ambitions and the renewable movements of the world, they'd all get on much quicker together, rather than having an endless war of hostility and trying to strand assets and attacking the oil companies and so on. There's a way forward. It's much better in harmony. But as far as rival technologies are concerned, I'm not sure I agree with Jennifer. I think competition has got to perform. There's got to be the drive for more efficiency. That's what's happening with dramatic cut in the apparent fall in the costs of offshore wind. This has been driven by tremendous technological application, brilliant minds, bringing down the costs of the turbines you have to put on top of the pylons, and all the costs in the transmission, the switching stations, and all the rest, and the system costs as you integrate with the grid. This has been a terrific story, wonderful, and of course it is competing with nuclear. And I think those who say let's just push ahead on everything, regardless of cost, to cut down carbon, in the end are going to be the enemies of carbon reduction, because it's going to create, and is already creating, a considerable backlash as people find some of the costs that are being asked to bear for carbon reduction simply are not justified in terms of reliability or contribution to CO2 emission cuts overall or to climate change. And this is really slowing down the whole carbon emissions campaign. So I say, yes, let there be argument, let there be competition, and let's see that rather than the government hopelessly picking winners which turn out not to be winners, we do see technology and competition drive down the price of carbon reduction to the point where it is manageable and competitive in in the right areas.
I don't disagree with any of that. I think what I don't like is the name calling because people maybe work in different sectors or support different low carbon technologies. And I think that that is unproductive, but I agree that I think competition for innovation is a really good thing because it does allow fast moving technologies to happen and for radical disruptive innovation to occur. So that is a good thing, but what's happening at the moment is not radical or disruptive. It's quite painful.
On a small scale, we should say, the two reports that I plugged at the beginning of this event, Driving Down Emissions and Power 2.0, we did show that there are huge advantages for consumers of adopting smart metering, smart charging, off-peak, charging your vehicle off-peak, for example. And homes are going to start moving. I think the first generation of smart meters in the home have been criticized because they weren't very smart. They show you how much electricity you use at what time, but in order to take advantage of that, you need to have engaged consumers who are checking their electricity, penny pinching, and looking to where they can reduce their energy bills. But I'm not sure if we have expertise on the panel, but what would the smart grid and what would like a smart home look like to you?
From my point of view, smart distributed networks, I think, are a really good idea. I think, as I mentioned before, tying them up with housing policy is really important. But there are elements about smart and distributed that, again, we have to be careful about and that do concern me. And these come around that as we have higher penetration of renewables into distributed grids, you get a little bit less reliability in the system, which means that you could end up with an inequality between people who choose to use distributed systems and those who buy themselves out of them. So if you don't want to have your lifestyle disrupted in any way, then you buy yourself out of your distributed system and you buy a more centralized and more reliable resource. But it does mean that those people on lower incomes or those people with less choice, less understanding of how their smart homes work, how their new distributed system works, are stuck in the worst energy pricing as they are now is often the case as well. So looking at ways in which we can create better equality between consumers as our systems change, and I think as the DNOs become DSOs and start managing these systems, that's a role that they can play in engaging with communities to actually make sure that they understand what they're getting.
So and I was just going to say, in terms of where we're focusing our innovation, it's on the supply as opposed to the consumption side. And apart from the fundamental logic of economies of scale in small modular reactors, we're also looking to embed as much of our new digital technology in those power plants, replicating what we've successfully done on the aerospace side of our business and our engine health monitoring services, so that we can effectively help the utility to optimize the efficiency of the plant and also to drive down outage periods and maintenance costs. So load factors could go from the current level of about 78, 79% right up into the 90%, and the overall cost burden for the utilities and therefore the price that they can offer into the grid comes down pretty significantly through the 60 or 70-year life of a reactor.
Something we touched on briefly earlier, but I'd like to talk about skills. And as an engineer myself, and I'm also a chartered mechanical engineer, something we go on and on and on about is skills, and whether we have enough engineers, whether we're bringing them through or not, whether the ones of the previous generation were better than the ones of this generation. So, Harry, do you think Rolls-Royce?
I was going to say.
Are you happy with the supply chain of skills coming through, or what can the government do more?
So I would regard nuclear industry and nuclear skills to be a strategic asset for the country. Not only are they necessary to power independent nuclear deterrent and the Royal Navy's fleet of nuclear-powered submarines, but they're also required if we're going to have our own indigenous capability in civil nuclear power plants, as opposed to being reliant on the imports of foreign technology based on foreign skills. And at the moment, the skills position is fragile, to be honest. The skills were allowed to erode quite a lot in the late 90s and the first part of this century. Rolls-Royce has spent the last 5 to 10 years reinvesting and building those skills up again. And I don't think it's in anyone's interest to see those erode again over the next 5 to 10 years.
I mean, I really admire what Rolls-Royce are doing, but we shouldn't underestimate the intensity of the international competition there. I mean, the Americans are racing ahead on this front. The Koreans, or they've got other problems, of course. The Chinese are investing enormous amount in their nimble dragons and their smaller modular reactors, and are thinking, just as rather amazed, we're all being amazed this week, the Chinese suddenly announced they want to phase out all diesel and oil by 2040. They're now talking almost equally dramatic terms about phasing out all the sort of major heavy-duty grid systems and localizing and distributing high-voltage electricity as well as normal lower voltages as well. So they're coming. Even the Russians are hovering around. They've been successful in selling quite a few nuclear power stations in the Middle East, Hungary and so on, Egypt and all others, and are now talking about smaller modular reactors. So it's a huge international effort, and we're going to have to be extremely agile on this island and very, very intelligent to put our resources into it. I think it's terrific what Rolls-Royce are doing.
Jennifer, does the institution of mechanical engineers have a position on skills?
Well, yes. I mean, I think the Engineering UK has estimated that there's over 100,000 empty spaces for engineers every year within the industry. I think the nuclear sector is about to suffer another dramatic change on that when we leave Euratom, it will prevent the movement of nuclear engineers and construction workers around Europe as easily as it has been, and this is going to present us with other challenges because we've relied very heavily on having that give and take with Europe for a long time. There are some phenomenally good apprenticeship programs, not just from places like Rolls-Royce, but also if you look at somewhere like Sellafield, who have around 500 apprenticeships going through at a time, and they are supporting and creating life, careers, opportunities for the young people who are living up in West Cumbria, which, if you've ever been up there, is one of the most difficult places to get to. And so it means that the kids can actually stay there. Whereas I live in Wales and they all leave as fast as they possibly can. So there is this need to ensure that we are creating good engineering opportunities that allow high skills, high wages, and to support people to stay within the areas where their families live if they should want to. I think just to sort of say a little bit more, and I probably would be remiss if I didn't say something about gender equality in engineering, but this hasn't changed since about 1970, and we have been banging a drum about the level of equality in engineering, that we need more women, that there's only 9%, but broadly speaking, that this hasn't changed over a long period of time. So we have to start to ask ourselves the question, is this the right drum to be banging? And maybe actually what we need is greater diversity in engineering, and that's across the board. We need to ensure that people from various communities across the UK, once we leave the European Union, are able to access really good apprenticeship programs, are familiar with what is available to them, and have actually got these opportunities open to them. And I would encourage all people who work in industry to actually work with local schools and those in disadvantaged communities to actually ensure that the brightest and the best kids really do get these opportunities, and also some that perhaps have the potential to be the brightest and the best but don't know it yet, so they can come through as well. So it's making sure that those opportunities are opened up, and I do look to you as the industry to do that.
Can I say a word about the dreaded Brexit in Europe, as it's been mentioned? I mean, I myself, we've all got mixed feelings in this room about the leaving and remaining. I myself voted Remain, I don't mind saying. But this is one area where where staying in the old treaty systems of a tight European Union, I don't think was necessarily the best thing for European nuclear development. I mean, there's no doubt that Germany's unilateral decision to cut out of nuclear power and phase it out, now followed by Austria and Switzerland, was a major blow to effective European nuclear cooperation. And we do need anyway to be thinking, even if it wasn't for Brexit, we need to be thinking in terms of new treaty and new forms of cooperation which somehow don't include Germany unless they reverse their decision and come back in, which I suppose is not impossible, and also addresses the problem of a new cooperative structure to replace or build on the Euratom structure, which was in some ways bound up with the EU treaties, and therefore was raised when we came to make the Brexit policy strategy decision. So I'm not unhopeful that I think the Euratom system needed a shake-up anyway. I think we do have to sew together good, effective European nuclear cooperation. But it was going to be impossible under the old treaties. The Maastricht and the previous treaties, Treaty of Nice and all the rest, were not delivering the framework because Germany had destroyed it. So I think there's a better pattern ahead. I'm not too worried about Brexit and on that aspect anyway, on the nuclear side.
I think that's a very good point. I think nuclear research, if you don't have Germany on board in the EU context, I mean, we're funding a very expensive nuclear fusion reactor in the south of France, which may never produce much of value. But the nuclear research at the EU level will suffer if Germany is completely anti-nuclear. We're coming towards the end, so I would like to, if any of you are ready, to just give your final comments before we take questions from the audience on whatever topic you think is most important to you from this event, the electric economy or nuclear power or SMRs. Who is ready on that short notice? All right.
Shall I go? I think I set out in my opening remarks the really significant challenge in terms of creating new low-carbon electricity generating capacity in this country over the next 15 to 20 years. I do believe, and I think my colleagues on the panel agreed, that it needs to be a mix of technologies, renewables, CCGT with carbon capture systems and nuclear. But the challenge for the nuclear sector is pretty significant, 40 gigawatts of new capacity over the next 20 or so years. And we see SMRs as being a really essential, in fact, absolutely vital part of that nuclear technology mix. Moving effectively from the old paradigm of economies of scale to a new paradigm of economies of volume, being able to modularize and standardize the design of the entire power plant, not just the reactor island, the entire power plant, which allows you to do all the complex, costly manufacturing inside a factory environment with the attendant benefits of quality, being able to get all the attendant benefits of volume as you produce multiple modules throughout a prolonged and sustained period, makes the plants cheaper to build and easier to finance, and ultimately produces low carbon, reliable, secure electricity for the consumer at a competitive price. So we believe this is a once in a generation opportunity to launch a UK programme for SMRs here in the UK, and we're really excited about it.
Thank you, Lord Howell?
Well, without doubt, it's the need to get investment in and the construction of low carbon generating capacity, and which meets the likely growth of demand, which may not be quite as dramatic as we think, given the amazing prospects in energy efficiency. So things may not grow as fast as feared on the demand side, but nevertheless the demand is going to be colossal. The need for new low carbon capacity is essential. How you match that with the investors' willingness to invest is the major challenge, and we may end up, as you've hinted, Chair, with the government having to go back to taxpayer financed and government financed, heavily more than subsidised and even finally invested in huge capacity to get at the plant we need. Otherwise we're heading for real dangers on the reliability and security side.
Thank you. Jennifer, some optimism maybe?
I think, as I mentioned a few times, so I'll just say it again, making the connection with housing policy particularly, and also with local development plans, the way in which transport networks are put together. One statistic that I have is that transport is 23% of our greenhouse gas emissions, around 40% of our energy use goes into transport. So we have to make sure that we make the connections across all of the different networks, the whole energy system, including industry, including housing, including utilities and things like our sewage networks, and making sure that we're looking at the whole picture, because that allows us to actually pick up the most sustainable reuse of materials. It allows us to look at ways in which we can create different fuels, particularly for freight and shipping, which use more oil, and actually the amount of oil in those areas is increasing rather than decreasing as it is in other types of transport. And I think, again, looking at alternatives for jet fuel. So all of these areas contribute towards our CO2 targets, but we don't talk quite so animatedly about them as we do perhaps about the electricity system, which is actually a very small part of it, and on its own it's just electricity. It's not really a system, so we have to make sure that we connect it up with everything else.
Thank you. I'd like to open it to the audience now for any of our panelists, and they'll do their best. At the front here, the gentleman. Yes. Oh, sorry, wait for the mic and your name and organisation.
Adam Chase from E4Tech, the consultancy. I agree, I think, with Lord Howell's point that perhaps the forecasts for demand are not quite as steep as some people are saying, particularly because of the role that efficiency can play. But within that, we will have we'll need for smarter energy, because we're definitely going to have a lumpier, spikier demand. Just briefly mention a piece of work that BEIS is going to be publishing shortly, which we were involved in, which is looking at the experience on demand-side response around the world, lessons that can be learned from who does what. And who does it well, because at the moment it's an open book. And a very quick question for Harry. I think you mentioned that your SMRs can produce heat as well as power, as in usable heat. Is that the case, and is that really going to happen?
Thank you.
Harry? Yep. So it's absolutely to Jennifer's point about coordination with housing policy. If you're creating new towns, new cities, and you can build in the infrastructure, then yes, you can effectively take the extra heat off an SMR and use that to provide residential and commercial heating for small communities.
There was a lady just there.
Hi, Lizzie Lunn from ENA. Just a couple of points. The first one is that to make people aware that the ENA is working on the Open Networks project, which is looking at a number of things that has been mentioned already, such as the transition to DSO and how we move to the smart grid. And they're at the moment holding a consultation looking at how to provide opportunities and route to market for distributed energy. The other thing, also just to make it a point that I think needs to be made really clear, is that electrification isn't the only option. We did mention using hydrogen for electricity, but also I think the gas networks are a massive asset, and something that I think it's something like 80% of our energy needs are provided from gas during peak demand, which includes electricity, heating and cooking. And my question really is a big issue which hasn't really been mentioned, is fuel poverty, and how the panel feels that it is the best way to tackle that.
Thank you.
Is it oil policy or fuel policy?
Fuel poverty. Fuel poverty.
Fuel poverty. I did mention it.
Well, we have done some previous work. So Richard Howard, one of our ex-head of energy policy, has done a lot of work on warmer homes and things like this, if you look up our reports. But I think it is down to energy efficiency, and I think the government have recently announced policies on this, on insulating homes of the most vulnerable people in the country. That's got to be the first thing. I did mention briefly hydrogen for the gas network, which I'm wholly supportive of. And I wrote a blog a couple of weeks ago about how perhaps electrolysis is not yet cost competitive for producing hydrogen, but you could produce it from steam methane reformation of natural gas and combine that with carbon capture and storage so that it's low carbon, as a way of kick-starting the hydrogen economy until electrolysis and more advanced ways of producing it come online.
Yes, well, I mean, fuel poverty is down to energy bills. Energy bills are going to come down partly on the demand side of the things you've just mentioned, Chairman, but also by those who are supplying, on the supply side, getting the costs down and managing to combine the aims of low carbon with affordability, which we actually failed to do. We have failed on that objective. Energy is not affordable, hence the fuel banks and the fuel poverty, hence the difficulties of many of our industries with high costs compared with other countries and other competitors. So let's be clear-eyed about, again and again we come to the point that it's the heart of this matter is energy costs. Now, the one issue we haven't mentioned, the sort of real unmentioned issue this morning, is the price of oil and the price of gas worldwide. If, as seems highly likely, we're going to see a combination of demand but even more vast surpluses of supply around the world, shale and all the rest, we're going to produce surpluses of oil and gas, huge inventories for years to come, and hydrocarbons are going to stay cheap. For the developing world, that is a major agony and choice. Do they go for the cheap power they must have for development, and what price do they pay for going down the low carbon route? These are really agonizing choices which India and to some extent China and the whole developing world is having to make daily, and often under acute political pressures for getting prices down. So we can't shut our eyes to that. At the heart of it all is cost, and the responsibility of policymakers must be to combine the low carbon need to save the world, which is right, with the affordability to save peoples and enable us to save our large parts of the world from starvation and misery and low development.
I think that's absolutely right. I think inevitably our focus initially goes to the the private consumer, the residential households. The people are going to feel the impact of high energy costs. There's another lens through which to look at it, which is that actually for big businesses to invest in the UK post-Brexit, one of the things they look for is decent infrastructure, guaranteed supply of cost-competitive energy. So there's a wider economic argument here as well.
I think we should say that the energy efficiency measures that we've put in place over the last decade or so have been not as far as I would have liked. They haven't gone as far as I'd liked, but analysis I've read by Carbon Brief and so on suggests that although the renewable subsidies have put up bills or put up the cost of electricity, the average bill has gone down due to energy efficiency measures, so they have been broadly successful. We had a question at the front here, Ralph.
Good morning, Dominic Martin from Statoil. I'd like to return to the point that a couple of the panelists made about the need to introduce proper competition between different types of technology and power generation, but I think it could also apply to different technologies in terms of heat as well. How, given different technologies have different levels of maturity in terms of their, some have been around forever, some are very new on the scene. Other technologies have different carbon profiles from other technologies. How do you need to redesign the system to deliver genuine competition between different technologies on a level playing field? What needs to be done?
Well, a steadily rising carbon price would help. A credible carbon price that has cross-party support, rising steadily to pick the low-hanging fruit in the decarbonisation tree. And then it's a very difficult problem, as you say, because we say we're selling electrons, but the electrons from solar come at a different time from the electrons at wind that aren't dispatchable. So you've got coal and gas are dispatchable, but they have externalities in terms of climate change and pollution that aren't totally factored in. So it's a huge challenge to actually have completely technology neutral competition. I don't know if any of the panelists.
I think we tend to focus a lot on price. What you tend to hear is that the primary reason for us choosing a particular technology is that it's doing the job at the cheapest cost, but actually that cost is based on how much the electricity is costing them to produce, but not necessarily on the wider whole life cycle of that particular technology. And I think we do actually need to look at things in more detail. We need to plan more for the future. So we need to make sure that we understand exactly what kind of impact technologies have long term. So for example, just to give a sort of idea of a potential future, not one that's actually going to happen, but it might. But say fusion takes off and we've installed huge amounts of offshore wind, you're going to go through a decommissioning process with that is going to be bigger than the offshore decommissioning of oil rigs, for example. So knowing and actually trying to analyse things in more detail, do better long-term planning will mean that we don't find ourselves kind of repeating history as we did perhaps with coal, although we might all disagree on the role that coal has played, and ensuring that actually we do look at not passing our impact on. So another area where we have a tendency to pass our impact on is radioactive waste disposal. So we just hold on to it rather than actually looking at ways to manage it effectively. So we just keep passing that on. It becomes an intergenerational energy issue rather than us taking control of it and actually dealing with it. So I think making sure that there is proper analysis of these different technologies, not what often feels to me to be what's popular, what's kind of half an analysis, and anyone asks a difficult question, they get told that they're not a supporter or they're an idiot, which often happens, and probably has happened to everybody at some point. So I think it's just making sure that we are prepared to challenge each other to actually deliver the best solutions.
So I think, I think Jennifer, I broadly agree with you. It's important that when we're talking about cost, we just don't focus solely on that technology. We have to take into consideration your point, the through life cost, but also the whole system cost. So, if we're talking about more renewables, which require more storage, which require more capacity because the load factors are low and require smart grids, one's got to take into consideration the entirety of the system cost. So I do think it's important that we get a standard way of thinking about cost as opposed to just pinpointed on a particular technology at a time.
I think the short answer to Dominic's question is obviously carbon price and agreed carbon price internationally, which was a huge objective, combined with steady rolling down of subsidies on all generating capacity from all sources over the years. Some hope, given that we've now locked ourselves into a subsidy for 35 years with Hinkley C. So that's the short answer. I wanted to make one other point, I've forgotten what it is, but that's it. Yeah.
So just another plug where we are doing a project. We haven't launched it or announced it yet. We are doing some work on carbon pricing that we'll be launching in the new year, and we will be having a round table on carbon pricing, which if any of you are experts in that area or would like to contribute, then feel free to email me, Matthew Rooney.
Jenifer triggered something else on decommissioning. We all know about decommissioning and nuclear, which nearly sunk the whole nuclear industry when it came to privatization in the 1980s, the 1990s. Decommissioning for offshore oil rigs is another sore. And now Jenifer's raised rightly the decommissioning of all these wind pylons scattered over the North Sea, many of which have been plonked down without any regard for decommissioning and redundancy at all, locked into the seabed with vast concrete emplacements, are going to cost a fortune. I have met gentlemen from Belgium who think they're going to make their fortunes out of this decommissioning, and they probably are, but it's going to cost. And is that cost included? We don't really know.
I shouldn't have said anything and just opened up a wind turbine decommissioning company, shouldn't I?
We'll all be investing.
Yeah.
Well, we'll take one at the back, and then I think we might have had one or two here at the front as well.
Hi, Johnny Marshall from ECIU. I'd like to ask a couple of questions based on the Rolls-Royce report and hear the views from the whole panel as well, please. The first is on the section advantages to the UK's nuclear deterrent programme. Seems to imply that by paying £60 a megawatt hour for SMR power, that you're going to reap benefits in the defence sector. Just wonder what the panel's view on using energy bills to contribute towards the defence budget are. And the second question is on the section making it happen, government support for SMRs. So assuming this is the same Rolls-Royce modified PWR based on technology that's been going since the 50s, if we still need government support for such an old way of generating power. Cheers.
Okay, I'll get the debate going. Well, I'll do it in reverse order. So what we are not talking about is taking a PWR for a nuclear submarine and sticking it on land and generating power. The reactors in both those circumstances are being asked to do fundamentally different things. So a reactor that goes into a submarine is working within very tight confines in terms of space. It won't be refueled for 25 or 30 years, and it needs to operate in a very harsh environment, potentially in the face of enemy action, and needs to provide power to the captain of that submarine very agilely and very responsively. So that's a completely different design in terms of what you need on land, where you're less constrained in terms of space. You get the thing up to maximum power and leave it there for a considerable period of time, and you can refuel it, every few years. You don't have to leave the fuel in there for the entirety of its life. So we're talking different designs. Now, clearly, the individuals, the nuclear design engineers that we have and the skills that they have are able to apply those skills on both different types, but the actual technology is different. So I'd like to dispel the myth that it's simply a submarine reactor on land. And then your other point about the benefit to the nuclear industry at large. So all we are saying in the report is that, it's a reflection of what I said about 10 minutes ago, is that our nuclear skills, our nuclear supply chain in this country is fragile. That is a fact. And were we to be able to utilise and reinvest in those skills on an SMR programme, that would effectively, all boats float on a rising tide. You know, the whole ability of the sector would be strengthened and would increase substantially.
I don't think the other panellists have had the opportunity to read the report.
I've read a bit of it. I would just make a comment on the that we're signed up to something called the Non-Proliferation Treaty. I don't know if you're aware of it, which to a certain respect should keep some of our civil nuclear programs separate to our defence programme. The UN recently opened up the opportunity for all countries to sign up to banning nuclear weapons altogether, and not one country that is a nuclear country signed up to it, whereas almost every single other country did sign up to it, which means that the UK is not unique in its idea that it doesn't plan to remove nuclear weapons anytime soon. But the non-proliferation and the new safeguards approach should ensure that there is a separation between the two, and I'm sure that within your business there's a separation.
Yeah, there's an absolute separation between the two.
Just to remember that it is the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and it's enormous strains it's under with countries like Pakistan, Israel, and now North Korea attempting to move into nuclear weapons. That is at the heart of the whole Asian crisis at the moment.
Maybe take a couple more questions, maybe take two questions if we have them, and then wrap up. There's the two gentlemen at the front here. We'll take the two together, shall we? Thank you.
Dr Baxter, joined British Gas straight out of university and spent 25 years with Shell in gas and power. My question is about awareness in the general public and in politicians of these sorts of issues. I've been staggered at the lack of understanding of power systems in particular amongst politicians, particularly in 2008 when all the discussions were going on around that. But I also find that when I talk to my friends in the North London chattering classes, people who I consider to be well informed and interested and curious on all sorts of other topics, are not just ignorant but don't want to know about these sorts of issues. So my question is, how can we sort of increase the profile and awareness and understanding of politicians and the general public of what I think we all perceive to be a critical thing to get right?
Should we take the second question, and then we can...
Geoffrey Owen from Policy Exchange. I wonder if I could ask Lord Howell if in his criticisms of government policy, he would also include policy towards electric cars, because the present government seems to be very keen to accelerate the replacement of petrol cars by electric cars. It's putting quite a lot of taxpayers' money into batteries to try and boost the whole value chain that leads to electric cars. Is that a good use of taxpayers' money or not?
Lord Howell wants to answer that, then we'll broaden out the first question to the panel.
I mean, I think Geoffrey, of all people, as distinguished ex-editor of the FT, it's a question of balance. How much do how much bob do you put on which horse? If the government, and I fear as often great enthusiasm sweeps through the policymakers, the government start raising the subsidies, raising the support, picking the winners, backing this technology instead of that. And while it obviously is a good thing to see us move towards a non-hydrocarbon transport system, it's got to be done in a balanced way. I mean, it's not just cars, it's every freight vehicle that exists is diesel at the moment. They've all got to be unscrambled somehow. Do they go electric, or do they go for a more efficient petrol or a more efficient diesel even? I mean, I noticed the man from Shell, you would expect Shell to be saying, wait a minute, about electric cars, but they were saying something quite sensible the other day, which was that on the path of technology, you really can't work out exactly how in 10 or 15 years' time which technology is going to be the most carbon reduction efficient and the most competitive and the most sensible in terms of nitrous oxides and other things. We just don't know. Technology is going to decide, and if the government makes yet another plunge into a particular kind of technology, its chances of getting it right are rather slim. So we may be going just about over the top on electric. And on the other hand, I read that France, they've gone even farther over the top, and now even Beijing sounds as though it's going over the top. So I don't know. I leave it to technology and the markets. They're the gods I worship.
And so the first gentleman's question on the public perception, public knowledge of energy technology, is this something that frustrates you or not?
Well, I think there's lots of different angles that you can take. There is an issue around education. I'll tell you a couple of very brief stories. I was watching Educating Greater Manchester with my kids the other day, and the geography teacher said to the class, "Is climate change a man-made problem or a natural problem?" I was sitting there thinking, are those their only two options? You know, there's a combination of both. So it's kind of like a little bit about them getting a half-truth. So, and, you know, it's not that interesting when you're growing up. There are other things, managing your Instagram account, making sure that your social media is all up to date, getting out there and socializing with each other. It's one of the reasons that we actually don't get so many engineers coming through, because they don't have access to, you know, hack spaces in their school, for example, places where they can actually go and access information about these things. Then another story is that my closest friend is a psychologist, and she sent me a text the other day saying, how do they know that the hurricane is going to hit Florida on Friday? I thought, that's a really daft question. Like, there's a satellite. But she had no idea that there was a satellite. I mean, why would she? I mean, so this is a person who's in their 30s and had no idea how weather was monitored, because that's not the background that she comes from. So I think that there is the way in which we communicate information, where it's used, where it's accessed. I remember during the Let's Recycle campaign that all over EastEnders, in every cafe, there was a Let's Recycle poster in the background. So people had that kind of subconsciously coming at them all the time. So raising awareness and what's important to people may not actually be necessarily what we as engineers think is important. People want stuff to work. They don't want it to be a pain. They don't want to have to ring up and ask why it doesn't work. They just want it to work. So making sure that people have the information, making sure people learn it, making sure young people have access to experiment with electricity, have an opportunity to experiment with gas. I recently went to a lecture, it was done by the Formula One program, where they put a load of gas into a canister and then set fire to it so it blew up, just to show how combustion engines work, which I thought, well, this is great. But there isn't enough of that. You know, my kids have never attended anything like that, and they go to a reasonably good school in Cardiff. So if I'm not having my children going to it, then people who have even less opportunity or awareness themselves won't even know that their kids aren't getting access to it. So raising it up through the whole of the population from the beginning, I think, is definitely the way forward.
Yeah, no, I agree. You know, energy security, energy policy is not one of those things that sort of naturally grabs public attention. But it's in a way a little bit like defence policy. It's one of those prerequisites that we require from government, a long-term strategic policy. And that should be largely sort of impervious to changes of flavour of government every 5 years or whatever the cycle is that we're currently on. I mean, the way to grab people's attention is for the lights to go off.
Yeah.
And I know that sounds a bit dramatic, but it's fair to say that we have been, as a country, very close to significant brownouts at about Christmas time, as everyone's putting their Christmas turkeys in the oven and turning on the episode of EastEnders. We've been very close to brownouts, you know, 2 to 3 Christmases out of the last sort of 4 to 5 years. So if we want to grab people's attention, that's a pretty immediate way of doing so.
Or turn off the internet.
I answer the question with a question. What are we to make of a parliament and a policy making and a Whitehall system that inevitably raises the costs of energy by pursuing energy policies involving extensive green levies and charges of all kinds? I think it's, they say, about £153 a year on the average bill. And behind that requires huge new investment in low carbon electricity, as we all want to see, and in cutting out the cheapest forms of energy. And then says energy prices are too high, we must go around and see if we can cap them. Let's go and cap what we've just raised. I mean, is that awareness, or is that just the charms of politics where you don't worry too much about the facts?
I think I'd just like to plug, there are organisations like the Institution of Mechanical Engineers who try to promote this stuff. Other organisations I admire, like the Royal Society, put out some very good, accessible documents. And all sorts of organisations have science festivals all over the country all year. So we do try. I've been a STEM ambassador for many years. We do try, but there are many competing things for people's attention. So I'd just like to conclude by thanking you all for coming on this morning, and could we all thank the panel for a lively discussion.